September 1979 brought unusually dry and stifling heat to the remote taiga village of Beloy Yar, turning the needles on the young larches yellow long before the first legal frost. The air in the valley, sandwiched between steep rocky hills and the endless green sea of the remote Siberian taiga, lay still, smelling of dried moss, peat, and the nearby smoke of forest fires. The locals, accustomed to navigating the whims of the wild, rejoiced in the lingering warmth and took their time stocking up on firewood for the winter, lazily spending their evenings on their benches, accompanied by the rare sounds of autumn midges. The head of the local logging company cheerfully reported to the district about exceeding their timber haulage plans, while tractor drivers and sawyers carefreely enjoyed their easy shifts, confident that nature would gift them with a mild, short, and light snow winter. Amid this general rural relaxation and carefree atmosphere, only one person in all of Beloy Yar evoked surprise, mixed with outright pity and ridicule from his neighbors. 74-year-old Luka, known locally as Grandpa Luka because of his stern demeanor and huge, gnarled hands, hadn't shown up at the local store for 3 weeks, spending all his days on the farthest, most secluded edge of his property. A former front-line bridge carpenter who had served throughout the war as a member of the engineering assault brigades, he had a heavy gaze beneath bushy grey eyebrows and a strange habit of trusting dry calculations over the promises of weather forecasters on the radio. While his neighbors rested after harvesting their meager gardens, Luka, with the first rays of dawn, would wander deep into the forest to the foot of a huge, centuries-old oak tree that grew right at the edge of his property near a steep, rocky cliff. This giant oak tree, with its spreading crown and 3-girth trunk, was a local landmark, its powerful root system dug deep into the rocky soil of the hill, forming deep, dark folds and natural grottos at its base. It was under this colossal tree that the old man began a massive, grueling excavation project that, from the outside, seemed like the sheer madness of a failing mind. Armed with a heavy bayonet shovel, an old army crowbar, and a tempered pickaxe, Grandpa Luka methodically cut a deep vertical shaft right between the oak's massive roots, thick as bulls' torsos. His old flannel shirt was soaked through with sweat after a couple of hours of work. His face was coated in grey earth dust, but the old man stubbornly continued to dig into the rocky taiga ground, centimetre after centimetre. He carefully lifted each bucket of excavated grey clay and crushed limestone to the surface, using a homemade wooden winch, carefully hauled it deep into the forest in an old wheelbarrow, and meticulously camouflaged it with dry branches and fallen pine needles, as if trying to conceal the traces of a major war crime. The first to notice his neighbor's strange maneuvers was Fyodor Kravtsov, a 40-year-old tractor driver at the state farm. His spacious log house stood just 50 meters from Nazarov's plot. Fyodor often went out onto the porch to smoke after a hard shift, and watched with growing amazement as the elderly man bent his back under the weight of sacks and boulders on the edge of the cliff. One evening, Kravtsov couldn't resist stepping over a fallen fence and approaching a huge oak tree, peering into a black, echoing hole that plunged vertically down between its gnarled roots. From the depths of the pit emanated the smell of damp stone, cellars, and ancient underground coolness. And at the very bottom, by the dim light of a lantern, Grandfather Luka, with ferocious tenacity, was chipping away at another layer of grey shale with a pick. Fyodor laughed loudly, leaned his back against the mighty tree trunk, and called down to the old man, wondering if he was hoping to dig up Kolchak's gold beneath the roots, or if he had simply decided to build a personal grave closer to the rustling forest. Luka didn't even flinch at the sudden voice overhead. He simply slowly lowered his heavy pickaxe to the stone floor, wiped his forehead with his palm, and looked up at his neighbour with a heavy, absolutely serious gaze. The old man, quietly but clearly, stated that the earth wasn't holding moisture this year, that the birds were flying south without a cry and too low above the forest, and that the bark on the oak tree on the north side had become a finger's thickness. Luka added that the coming winter wouldn't just bring frost, but would literally squeeze all the life out of the valley, and that only those who managed to bury their heads under a reliable natural shield capable of retaining the deep warmth of the earth would survive. Fyodor merely spat dismissively onto the pile of fresh earth, dismissed the veteran's words as primordial prejudice, and declared that the state farm had provided him with 2 trucks of excellent birch slabs, and that the new brick stove in his 5-walled house would warm the house even in the bitterest frost. The tractor driver turned and left, and the next day the entire village of Beloy Yar was already buzzing with discussion about the latest eccentric idea of grandfather Luka, who had finally lost his mind in his old age. The men by the garages openly laughed, suggesting that the old carpenter was building a bunker in case of a nuclear war with the Americans, while the village women shook their heads pitifully, discussing how loneliness never leads to anything good. However, the old man remained completely deaf to the opinions of others and continued his solitary underground vigil, unaware that the gentle rays of the September sun were only the last calm before the most terrible natural nightmare that had ever befallen this taiga region. By mid-October, the warmth had finally left the Beloy Yar valley, giving way to a grey, prickly sky that hung low over the pine treetops. The wind shifted to a sharp, dry northeasterly, instantly stripping the last leaves from the branches and chilling the air to the point of the first serious frost. The villagers hastily closed their vents, corked their windows, and stoked their stoves, glancing toward the forest, where grandfather Luka's dim kerosene lamp still glowed at the foot of a giant oak. By this time, the old man had completed the hardest, roughest part of his work. The pit between the roots had sunk almost 4 meters deep, breaking through dense layers of clay and ending in a solid limestone slab. The walls of the future underground abode were uneven and rocky, but above the veteran's head stretched a veritable natural monolith. An intertwining of centuries-old oak roots formed a strong, springy vault, capable of withstanding the pressure of a multi-ton layer of earth and snow. It was now that Luka Nazarov began the most delicate, engineering-oriented part of his mysterious construction, drawing on all his extensive experience as a front-line carpenter. Instead of simply lining the well walls with random planks, he began assembling a complex, independent frame structure from hardened larch logs inside the pit. The old man personally selected dry, ringing larch trunks from the taiga, which had not rotted in the ground for decades and were comparable in strength to good Ural iron. He carefully sanded each log, soaked it in a thick solution of old tar, and lowered it with ropes into the darkness of the shaft, where he assembled a sturdy wooden caisson, firmly pressed against the rocky walls. Luka paid special attention to thermal insulation, understanding that in a confined underground space, a person's main enemy is not so much the outside frost as dampness and drafts. Between the log walls of his bunker and the rocky ground, he poured a thick, half-meter-thick layer of dry river pebbles mixed with charcoal. This layer was supposed to draw away excess moisture and serve as ideal drainage. The old man carefully caulked the inside of the logs with sphagnum moss, which he collected in remote taiga swamps and dried directly on the stove in his hut. In the corner of the dugout, Luka built a small but massive stone stove from wild river boulders, using a thick mixture of blue clay and horsehair instead of cement to prevent the masonry from cracking from sudden temperature changes. Neighbour Fyodor Kravtsov, driving past on his crawler tractor, often stopped by the fence, turned off the rumbling engine, and watched the veteran's painstaking work with a grin. Fyodor, who considered himself a progressive Soviet worker, sincerely couldn't understand why so much effort was expended on building a cramped underground burrow when everyone in the village had a sturdy, spacious wooden house with double floors. The tractor driver repeatedly told the men in the garage that Grandpa Luka was simply obsessing over his trench past and couldn't forget his front-line dugouts beneath the bunkers, since he was digging himself into the ground below freezing. The villagers would agree, laughing at the old man lugging heavy stones for the stove on his back, instead of sitting quietly on the porch drinking tea with raspberry jam. However, the old man ignored these rumours as he was concerned with something far more serious: the ventilation system of his underground nest. A regular straight pipe leading to the surface would instantly become clogged with snow and frost at the first severe frost, cutting off oxygen and turning the bunker into a mass grave. To avoid this, Luka implemented a clever reverse draft system he'd learned from old Siberian hermits on northern expeditions. He cut a horizontal backup channel through the limestone slab, extending toward the rocky cliff face and ending in a concealed exit amidst dense raspberry bushes. Fresh air, before entering the dugout, would pass through this long underground gallery, gradually warming by the natural heat of the deep layers of the earth, thus preventing condensation. By the end of October, the bunker beneath the oak tree's roots was almost complete. A heavy larch door, lined with a thick layer of felt and old tarpaulin, fit snugly into its grooves, completely cutting off the underground world from the outside world. Above, on the surface, only a discreet wooden hatch remained, carefully covered with dry pine needles and sheltered by massive branches, so that a casual traveller could pass within a few steps of the shelter and not notice a thing. Grandfather Luka climbed up for the last time in October, approached the edge of the rocky hill, and gazed for a long time at the quiet village of Beloy Yar, where the first thin wisps of smoke lazily rose from the chimneys of the huts. The old man adjusted his old fur hat with ear flaps, sighed heavily, and quietly declared, addressing the rustling taiga, that the trap had slammed shut, and the first real ice storm was no more than 3 days away from reaching the valley. In early November, the weather in Beloy Yar finally shed its mask, transforming the cosy taiga valley into a semblance of a lifeless polar plateau. A cosmic cold, wafting from the darkest depths of the endless Arctic tundra, gripped the village with a ferocity unmatched by even the oldest residents, who lived out their days on warm stoves. Daytime temperatures plummeted to -38 degrees Celsius, and by midnight, the mercury inexorably plummeted to a staggering 45 degrees below zero. The air in the village became so thick, dry, and prickly that breathing without a thick wool scarf tied over the eyes was physically impossible. Lungs instantly burned from the inside, and eyelashes froze into a single icy crust within minutes of being outside. The most terrifying thing was that not a single snowflake fell to the ground. The sky remained deathly transparent, dry, and starry, causing the planet's entire accumulated geothermal reserve over the summer to evaporate unhindered into outer space. Unprotected by a fluffy white blanket, the soil was completely exposed to the deadly attack, and the ice front began its inexorable vertical advance, deep into the Earth's crust, destroying everything in its path. The century-old pines and larches on the outskirts of Beloy Yar couldn't withstand this unnatural, arid stress. At night, a deafening, frightening roar, reminiscent of artillery fire, echoed across the taiga, the living tree trunks and rocky slopes cracking from the extreme cold. In the village itself, the living situation worsened with each passing hour, as the traditional log huts and cellars, which had served faithfully for centuries, proved utterly powerless against this anomaly. Fyodor Kravtsov, who was so proud of his stock of birch slabs, began to experience serious problems. The cold had crept under the massive pine foundation of his 5-walled house and was rapidly chilling the floors. The tractor driver was forced to fire his brick stove 3 times a day, burning through scarce firewood at an alarming rate. But the heat instantly escaped through invisible micro-cracks in the lower logs. The room was hot at head height, but on the floor, in the corners, the temperature dropped to 0, and the water in the buckets became coated with a thin layer of ice within just a couple of hours. All the potatoes and pickles that Fyodor had so carelessly stored in his shallow cellar turned into slippery, sweetish ice cubes, and the glass jars of cucumbers shattered, mixing the delicacies with sharp shards. Fyodor, angry and darkened from lack of sleep, paced the kitchen in his heavy felt boots, horrified by the realization that his vaunted preparation was melting away before his eyes, and winter had only just begun. Grandfather Luka maintained an almost military-like calm these days, meticulously following the instructions that had once saved his sapper battalion in the frozen swamps. Throwing on a heavy sheepskin coat and grabbing an old kerosene lamp, the old man leisurely made his way through the frost-covered vegetable garden to his camouflaged shelter beneath the roots of a giant oak tree. When Luka opened the upper wooden hatch and descended the larch ladder into the bunker, closing the heavy, felt-lined door tightly behind him, the outside world, with its 50-degree hurricane, instantly ceased to exist. An absolute, resonant peace reigned within the dugout, broken only by the measured, cosy crackling of dry larch logs in the stone stove. The old man lit the lamp, and its soft, golden light revealed the immaculately dry, moss-corked walls of dense logs, free of condensation or frost. The old army thermometer, mounted at chest level, reliably showed a steady 16 degrees Celsius, confirming that the veteran's brilliant calculation had worked perfectly. The oak's powerful root system, coupled with a half-meter-thick layer of gravel drainage and the stonework, formed an impenetrable shield that trapped the deep geothermal heat of the earth within this small underground ark. Luka chuckled with satisfaction, removed his heavy sheepskin coat, revealing himself in just a flannel shirt, and sat down on the wooden bunk, pouring himself a hot infusion of taiga herbs from a sooty teapot. From the reverse draft ventilation duct, which extended deep into the hill, the room received surprisingly fresh, clean air, already warmed by the underground passage, creating an ideal microclimate. The old man pressed his ear to the bunker wall and heard the raging ice storm far above, breaking the branches of a century-old oak tree. But here, at a depth of 4 meters, he was completely safe. Luka Nazarov looked at the neat stacks of dry firewood in the corner, at the sacks of crackers and dried meat, and quietly said into the darkness that the real trials for Beloy Yar were yet to come, because the ice blade had already penetrated the dry earth 1.5 meters, and soon the village would face something that no tractor from the state farm could fix. On November 20th, Siberia finally proved it was no joke, and the lumberjacks' bravura reports weren't worth a torn-out newspaper page. Beloy Yar was struck by a so-called black blizzard, a rare and terrifying taiga phenomenon when a hurricane-force wind rages across the ground in -50 degrees Celsius, -122 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. Instead of carrying fluffy snow, it merely strips away the dry topsoil, swirling black clouds of icy dust, small stones, and broken branches. The air in the valley became so thick and prickly that going outside without a thick wool scarf tied over the eyes was physically impossible. The deadly cold instantly seared the lungs, and visibility dropped to just 2 or 3 meters. But the worst of it was happening beneath people's feet, in the absolute darkness of the earth's depths, where the monstrous, unnatural cold continued its vertical advance, like a giant hydraulic press. The ground in the valley had already frozen to a depth of 1.5 meters, turning into a monolithic, ringing slab that completely refused to let any warmth from the huts inside. The first real disaster came from where it was least expected. from the village wells and the central water tower that supplied Beloy Yar with drinking water. Because the depth of ordinary pipes and private wells in the village rarely exceeded the standard 3 to 4 meters, the ice front reached the aquifers and within hours sealed them with a heavy, impenetrable bolt. Fyodor Kravtsov awoke at 4 in the morning to a strange, dull, grinding and cracking sound coming from the street, and when he ran out to his well with a flashlight, he was stunned. The massive pine rings of the log house were compressed by the ice expanding within the rock, so much so that they burst with a pistol-like sound, and the entire inner shaft turned into a solid ice monolith. Within a couple of days, the village was left without a drop of drinking water. People had to chop the dead, glass-hard ice on the Taiga River with axes, carry it in buckets to their huts, and heat it for hours on the stoves, wasting precious dry firewood, which was now worth its weight in gold. At the Zarya State Farm, the final act of the drama known as the Battle for Heating was unfolding at the same time. 2 additional coal-fired furnaces, which Stepan had been trying to stock the central garage with the best fuel, couldn't handle the 24-hour load. The main boiler's cast iron jacket had cracked due to extreme voltage and icy backdraft. Icy air rushed into the garages, and overnight the radiators of 3 heavy tractors froze to the core, completely paralyzing all the equipment on which the village's management had relied. The chairman, watching this devastation, sat in his office wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and hat, his head in his hands. He realized that the state farm was completely without power and frozen, with 4 more months of brutal winter ahead, and there was absolutely nothing left to save the people. At Fyodor Kravtsov's home, the situation was becoming critical. His spacious cellar, where just a month ago neat rows of pickled jars had stood, had finally surrendered to the elements, and the wood in the shed was running low due to the need to stoke the stove 3 times a day. The thermometer on the kitchen floor showed just 3 degrees Celsius, and the open cellar lid blew such a chilly chill that it felt like the open-air brunch of a polar station. Fyodor's wife quietly wept by the stove, wrapping the children in 3 blankets, while the tractor driver himself, angry, hungry, and blackened with frustration, twirled an axe in his hands, realizing that his vaunted modern hut had turned out to be a trap in the face of a true Siberian wrath. At that very moment, grandfather Luka was calmly going about his business inside the underground citadel beneath the roots of a giant oak, strictly following his sapper's routine and not allowing even a single wisp of draught into the bunker. The old man carefully added a couple of dry larch logs to the stove, brewed fresh tea, and sat down at the table, watching the thermometer, which remained motionless at 16 degrees Celsius. At this depth, securely sealed above by a meter-thick layer of pebble drainage, coal, and the powerful root system of the century-old tree, the earth acted as a giant natural radiator, maintaining a stable bark heat no matter what storm raged above. Luka Nazarov chuckled with satisfaction and pulled a piece of fragrant dried meat and a cracker from a birch bark box, knowing that while the entire village of Beloy Yar was slowly descending into icy chaos, his small engineering fortress was working with the precision of the Kremlin chimes. He knew that the surface freezing had reached its peak, and very soon, yesterday's scoffers would be forced to remember the existence of the crazy old man at the edge of the garden. By December 1st, the ground in Beloy Yar had frozen to a record depth of 2 meters. This ice sheet, completely impenetrable to ordinary crowbars and picks, completely paralyzed life in the village, turning every step down the street into a struggle for basic survival. The state farm was left without running water, and frightened milkmaids and tractor drivers were forced to manually chop ice from a taiga stream to save the breeding cows from thirst. Gloom reigned in the homes of the collective farmers. The frozen cellars smelled of rot and dampness, and the meagre vegetable supplies that people tried to save by the kitchen stoves were rapidly spoiling from the constant temperature fluctuations. All the former carefree pride of the collective farm chairman evaporated like morning fog, giving way to the harsh realization that the village was on the brink of a real food and humanitarian catastrophe at the very beginning of the protracted Siberian winter. Fyodor Kravtsov sat in his kitchen, gloomily gazing at the pile of sweetish, wrinkled potatoes his wife was trying to boil for dinner. These potatoes, frozen in the shallow cellar, were boiling down into a sticky, tasteless mush which the children ate with obvious reluctance and tears in their eyes. The tractor driver felt utterly crushed. His vaunted technical knowledge of engines and state-owned heating systems proved utterly useless in the face of this primal, natural fury. The firewood in his shed was melting before his eyes, and the temperature in the corners of the hut stubbornly hovered around freezing, forcing the entire family to sleep in winter clothes under 3 heavy blankets. At midnight, when the black storm outside howled with renewed, gut-wrenching force, Fyodor couldn't bear it any longer. He realized that if the frost intensified tomorrow, his children would simply freeze to death in this beautiful but completely frozen 5-walled house. Shame and pride battled for a long time in the 40-year-old man's soul, but the sight of frost appearing on the inner joints of the logs outweighed all former ambitions. Fyodor sighed heavily, threw his heavy sheepskin coat over his shoulders, grabbed a dim lantern, and slowly wandered over the snow-covered fence to the far edge of Luka's property, reproaching himself for every offensive word he had so thoughtlessly hurled at the veteran last fall. Having reached the snow-covered base of the giant oak, Fyodor had difficulty finding the hidden wooden hatch the old man had constructed above his underground fortress. He tapped the ice-covered wood with the heavy butt of his axe, and after a couple of minutes, the hatch slowly slid open, releasing a thick stream of surprisingly warm, moist steam into the frosty night. Grandfather Luka silently glanced at his frozen, shivering neighbour, whose sheepskin coat collar was completely covered in white, shaggy fur, and nodded, inviting him to descend the larch staircase. When Fyodor closed the heavy, felt-lined door of the bunker behind him, he blinked for a moment at the stark contrast. Inside Nazarov's dugout, a comfort reigned supreme, almost unreal for this dreadful night. The walls, made of thick, larch logs, exuded a dry warmth. A stone stove crackled steadily in the corner, and the mercury hovered firmly at 16 degrees Celsius. A steaming mug of lingonberry tea sat on the table, and neatly stacked, dry, prepared firewood lay in the corner, clearly enough to last the old man until spring. The tractor driver sank onto a wooden bench, buried his face in his huge, cold, roughened hands, and quietly, in a breaking voice, said he had come to ask for help, because his house was frozen to the ground, his firewood was running low, and his children were freezing in their icy beds. Grandfather Luka didn't even think to gloat or remind his neighbour of his autumn jokes by the garages. The veteran engineer simply silently pushed a mug of hot tea toward Fyodor, looked at him intently from under his bushy grey eyebrows, and calmly replied that in war and in the taiga, pride always perishes first, and the earth does not forgive the mistakes of those who have forgotten how to respect its laws. The old man added that the bunker beneath the oak tree's roots was not built for one person, and there was enough space here to save those willing to accept the power of the Siberian winter. By midday the next day, the small underground shelter beneath the roots of a giant oak tree had transformed into a veritable rescue camp for the Kravtsov family. Fyodor and Grandfather Luka, wrapping the children in heavy wool blankets, carefully carried them through the howling, dust-blackened vegetable garden and down into the warm, pine and moss-scented interior of the bunker. Fyodor's wife, exhausted from days of battling the cold in the freezing 5-walled shelter, burst into tears of relief for the first time in a long time when she felt the dry, steady heat of the stone stove instantly warm her frost-chafed fingers. The children, looking around in amazement, settled down on the sturdy larch bunks, mesmerized by the soft flame of the kerosene lamp, which cast whimsical amber shadows on the immaculately dry log walls. In the village of Beloy Yar itself, the situation had completely spiraled out of control for the state farm's management. The central heating system in the garages had completely turned into an icy monolith, and the homes on the outskirts, left without care or heat, began to collapse one after another. Panicked, people abandoned their freezing huts and flocked to the village council building, where the chairman was attempting to organize a vigil at the only remaining brick oven. Having learned from Fyodor, who had returned, that a completely autonomous underground bunker, protected from any weather conditions, was operating at the very edge of Nazarov's property, the chairman and the party organizer personally set out for the century-old tree. They walked, drowning in black taiga snowdrifts, unable to believe that the ordinary earthen burrow of an old man, which had been the laughingstock of all of Beloy Yar just a month earlier, could withstand this crushing 50-degree weather storm. When Grandfather Luka slightly opened the larch hatch, a thick, humid blast of warm underground air, the temperature of which, at a depth of 4 meters, remained steadily at 16 degrees Celsius, rushed out to greet the frozen leaders. The chairman, pale, with frostbitten cheeks and frost on his eyelashes, silently knelt before the hatch, peered into the bright, hot dugout, and in a low, trembling voice, asked the veteran sapper to at least let in women with infants from the most damaged huts. Luka Nazarov calmly surveyed the silent men with a stern gaze, adjusted his old fur hat, and replied that his front-line ark had been built not for pride or concealment, but according to the strict laws of engineering defense, and therefore there was enough space in the underground galleries extending deep into the hill to save everyone who was on the brink of death. The entire next week at Beloy Yar turned into a meticulously planned, brutal military operation to evacuate people to an underground citadel beneath the oak tree's roots, personally commanded by Grandfather Luka, drawing on his extensive experience as an assault engineer. Fyodor Kravtsov, along with the sturdy men from the state farm, stood guard around the clock at the hatch, helping to lower down the frightened women, children, and elderly, along with the meager remains of dried bread and warm clothing that had survived in the houses. Thanks to Luka's initial creation of a long, secondary ventilation duct deep into the rocky hill, the air inside the expanded bunker remained remarkably clean and fresh, and the stone stove, fueled by dry larch logs, kept the 47 people who had found salvation in this dark underground abyss warm without a single glitch. The bitter -50 degrees Celsius frosts that had gripped the Taiga Valley began to slowly and reluctantly recede only in mid-February, when a bright, spring-like, high and dazzling sun finally rose over the hushed Beloy Yar. The heavy ice shell, which had encased the dry earth to a record depth of 2 meters, thawed slowly and painfully, covering the country roads with deep, jagged wounds, sinkholes, and turbulent mudflows. But by the time the last dense snow melted from the hills, the village was a completely different place. This harsh ordeal had forever changed the minds of the locals and forced them to reconsider their attitude toward age-old wisdom and strict calculation. Not a single human soul in the village perished during that terrible, anomalous winter, and all 47 people who found shelter under the roots of the giant oak tree successfully returned to their homes thanks to the underground ark of the veteran sapper. In the spring, a new, younger, and more far-sighted chairman took over the state farm settlement. Fyodor Kravtsov, having completely reconsidered his life views, officially assumed the position of chief engineer for civil defense and municipal construction. The first thing Fyodor approved was a detailed plan for the large-scale reconstruction of all residential buildings and state farm facilities in the area, taking into account Luka Nazarov's unique experience. Under the watchful eye of the veteran carpenter, 16 central warehouses and cellars were reconstructed in Beloy Yar over the summer, their lower levels now extending well beyond the critical 2-meter mark of seasonal ground freezing. The old construction habit of relying exclusively on above-ground furnaces was forever a thing of the past, giving way to precise, mathematically calibrated geothermal insulation capable of withstanding any climate catastrophe. Luka Nazarov lived for another 11 years after that memorable winter, remaining a living legend for the entire region, an unquestioned authority and the taiga's foremost prophet, whose quiet words were heeded even by district officials. When Grandpa Luka passed away, people from all the surrounding villages and logging companies flocked to his funeral. Dozens of the men, women and grown children he had saved, who tearfully carried the veteran's coffin through the village to the forest cemetery. His old camouflaged bunker, once a symbol of salvation, was carefully surrounded by a beautiful wrought iron fence by new generations of collective farmers, turning it into a major historical monument to human foresight, resilience, and the profound understanding of the laws of nature. Even today, driving past the semi-abandoned Beloy Yar, one can spot from afar a massive granite slab erected by local residents at the foot of that same legendary century-old oak. On the dark stone, covered with a network of fine cracks from time, are carved in gold letters these simple yet profound words, which have become the main motto of these harsh places. Luka's bunker, rejected by human pride as a sign of madness, recognized by the earth itself as the highest engineering wisdom for saving lives. The deep large shaft continues to descend into darkness today, and the temperature at its bottom remains a steady 16 degrees Celsius, a reminder to all living beings that nature never forgives carelessness. True human security and survival are born not from attempts to subjugate the planet by force or bravura reports, but from the ability to hear the quiet voice of the earth in time, to read its ancient signs, and to build a home in a strong, conscious union with eternity.